We're about to start. Everybody get settled down. Find your seats. It's your 20-second warning. We're good. Okay, we're going to get started. Our next panel, first of all, for those who are just joining us, welcome. Our next panel is Writing for Social Change. And our moderator is Arnie Reisman. And he is an award-winning writer, producer, and performer. He regularly appears on the NPR comedy quiz show, Says You. He started as a print journalist and moved into radio, TV, and film. That's acting, directing, and producing. He recently added playwright and poet to his laurels, including Martha's Vineyard Poet Laureate. Arnie, over to you.
Is that me? Oh. Okay, I now have to introduce our panel, our illustrious panel. Just like this, I'm going to go this way down the table. First, Jenny Allen, who is the writer of Would Everybody Please Stop, which is a collection of wonderfully funny essays. She mainly can be found in the pages of The New Yorker, and there was a wonderful profile done on her last Sunday in the New York Times. After Jenny is Madeleine Blais, who has written this new book, To the New Owners, which is all about the destruction of her in-laws' wonderful house here on the island, and the change of life that one goes through, going through one house to another on this wonderful island. And she is also a journalist and a teacher of journalism. And finally, Richard North Patterson, whose latest collection is Fever Swamp, which is basically the whole last year we've been living through. And he's primarily not known for doing this, but this is a new turn in his life after writing many wonderful novels based on his life as an attorney and also wonderful legal thrillers. So, this is our great panel. And Rick's stories are all basically columns that he has done for the Huffington Post and the Boston Globe. So, it's supposed to be writing for social change. I just made a note that if writers really went to work every day with the knowledge that they had any influence at all, why would we be in this mess today? But, so let's start out. I'll go to the far end and work my way back about whether or not you actually feel you have any kind of influence thanks to your writing. And is this something that you actually entertain when you sit down to write whatever you're writing? Are you actually working from the point of view of, one of two things. Either I'm trying to get something off my chest, or I hope I'm getting something off my chest that everyone else I know can relate to. Rick?
The disheartening feature might be...
Listen.
The disheartening feature... They told me to talk.
There's no green light.
No green light here.
Green light.
Okay, there we go.
There we are. Okay.
The disheartening thing is I set out to write novels about capital punishment, about gun violence, about abortion rights, about money in politics, about the potential for nuclear terrorism, and every one of those problems has gotten worse. I think maybe if I wrote about if I wrote about World War, we'd have world peace. But so I have a certain humility about my ability to affect grand social change. But I do get up every morning and I write that column, aware that we've got a very segmented population, that lots of people are never going to read me, that the, quote, mainstream media has largely been tuned out. So I find myself in part trying to persuade folks what to do about Trump, how bad it really is, and also that people on the center and center-left have to stick together instead of fighting each other. One of the great discouragements last year, and I wrote all about it, was people saying, well, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, it's all the same. Well, no, it's not. That's crazy. And the notion that you would vote third party or stay home to exercise some feeling that you didn't get your ideal choices, I thought was crazy. So I've done my best, and hopefully around the margins I influence people, but I don't have any illusions that I'm writing for a mass audience of open minds, because it's not where we are.
Madeleine?
And actually, I set out to tell a much smaller story about one house on a small little point on this island. And so I have no illusions that I'm creating any kind of big social sweeping effects. Basically, I'm a born and bred New Englander, so I resist change as a form of recreation. And on the way here today, as I drove by Morning Glory Farm, which was one of my favorite, everyone who lives here, comes here as a visitor, has favorite places on the island, and that's always been one of my favorite places. But I had this little lament. They had to make it bigger. They got rid of the cheese wheel. I thought, so my world is a little smaller, but I agree with everything Rick said. So.
Jenny?
Yes, I thought so much about that. I mean, I feel like my world is even smaller than that. I feel like I spend lately, for example, I'm trying to think of a way to work into a piece the fact that I had a dream the other day, and my dream was that the West Tisbury dump was open on Tuesdays, not just Saturdays and Sundays. And I woke up and I thought, am I dreaming this? Because it was Tuesday and I really had a lot of trash. And that was my whole dream. It was open on Tuesdays. What a happy, that's my dreamscape. Very, very small. But I'm
Very comforting.
Very comforting. And then I went to check on the website. No. So yes, very small. I'm very happy to have a chance to be on this panel to say that, in fact, my work, such as it is, most of it, the stuff that's not just very silly, I do have an agenda, and I think my agenda is trying to help women feel seen. I think the older I get, the more I do think that we are scary to the opposite sex. And certainly nobody in this room, none of the men in this room, I'm sure that's, you're the exception, but I think in many ways we are very frightening to them. And I do have a certain, I come back again and again, I find, it finds me. It's not a decision. If I could think more abstractly about other things, I love it that you think about capital punishment and think. But I do find that these things, that this interest in women and women's lives and is, I mean, there's a silly piece in the book, but maybe not so silly, about the fact that women detective shows, even though the women have great authority, why are the women and the lady detectives, the women detectives, dressed in little tank tops and tight little blue jeans, and the boy detectives are wearing big boxy authoritative suits and ties? And you look at these shows, I love these shows. But what does that say about us? That's okay, that not one person at the network said, maybe she could dress up sometimes the way the boys do. So sometimes it's small, but I do try to, particularly women, I like talking about and to women of a certain age. I feel like we are invisible. I am surely not the first person to say that or feel it, but just the act of doing a book, I hope, says, hey, hi, we're here. We are standing right in front of you, guys and gals. Mm-hmm. We are right here. So I guess that's an agenda.
So you, in a sense, all of you are actually looking for some kind of pat on the head from your audience, some kind of an acceptance, some kind of understanding that you are reaching a group that understands what you're talking about. I mean, I found all of these essays not exactly scary because I was a man, but because they were so universally funny.
Thank you.
I mean,
Yes,
just the whole idea that you brought up subjects that nobody else would bring up. But also, part of the whole thing, and this may pertain mainly to Rick right now, I did pieces for a long time for Huffington Post to the point where I just said, I'm preaching to the choir. What's the point of doing this? You now have branched out and gone to the Globe. But that...
Whereas fountain of conservatism.
Yeah, whereas my wife points out, after the sports pages, they'll go to you. So, some of them. But I'd like to talk a little bit about finding your audience. And once you have found your audience, do you feel like, okay, how do I branch out and get a bigger audience?
Well, I just want to say one thing about the fear of women.
Yes.
Had I been more afraid, I'd be richer today. I often remark that alimony and tuition are a great inspiration to my art, but in any event, it's...
That's a good line, Jenny.
Yeah.
Could I have some? Thank you so
I think
much.
that may be in here.
There's a waiting list, which... but seriously, Arnie, it's really tough. What I try to do is write as credibly as I can and not be predictable. Mm-hmm. I don't want to be known as the, quote, liberal writer, because then you're just in a box. So I try to write about different subjects. I'll write about foreign policy, I'll write about all sorts of domestic issues, I'll write political analysis, and I'll write about law, because I used to be a lawyer. And hopefully you manage to engage people more broadly by covering different subjects in a less predictable way. The other thing is to be engaging. Obviously, we all try to do that, and my co-panelists have obviously succeeded brilliantly, but also to be credible. I mean, I really do my homework. I mean, my columns are sort of like a funnel. There's a lot at the top, and it's distilled into whatever length I'm able to write in. And I want them to be, factually dense, so that somebody might argue with my point of view, but they can't argue with my facts. Of course, the problem now is that people choose their own.
Yeah, that's a fact. I can't believe we're actually at that point. But Maddie, I would just like to know how you go about, you're now teaching journalism. What are you finding out there in terms of younger people wanting to go into a career that supposedly is going to, in some regards, affect social change?
Actually, at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, where I teach, we have that thing I never thought I'd have in my life, a new building. We got it 3 years ago, and it's state-of-the-art electronics for the young people who are looking to go into broadcast, and state-of-the-art, beautiful computer labs, et cetera. And we get a cohort of kids who are really, not all of them, but most of them, extremely dedicated to social justice and the pursuit of information and a free society and the First Amendment. And they come to us already kind of wired that way. And they're the kind of kids who spend all their time at the Collegian or the local radio station, as well as in class. So they divide their interests. They're not always the greatest scholars because they have so many other things going on. But I think there's hope amongst that group. So
that's good to hear. Oh, that's good. Jenny, what about your audience? You kind of mentioned the fact that you're a woman of a certain age writing for other women of a certain age, but clearly it's gone beyond that, and you obviously have touched a nerve if you can affect me.
I love it when men read my stuff. I just love it.
It's laugh out loud,
Well, thank
everyday
you.
observations.
Well, yeah, I
You know.
guess. Yeah, it is.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah,
No,
it is.
no, it is. It is.
Yeah.
But
No.
what were you gonna?
No, I just, I mean, when
Oh,
do you...
the audience. The
Yeah,
audience.
your audience, or when do you,
Well,
when
I
do you
love
come
it.
up to a topic and say, oh, that's worth writing?
Yeah. It does find me. I feel like these most of these pieces do, it's just what, mostly what's going on in my head, the little monologues that's going on in my head anyway. And sometimes well, every idea I think, oh, this is great, and I write it down, and then I noodle on it, and sometimes they just sputter out into nothing. And other times you can feel it, as you do too. You know, it's gonna. This is not channeling it. Certainly, that's so grandiose. But feel like it's. If I can hear it, other people will be able to hear it. And sometimes it is a little bit of outrage. I did do a piece up in there about Roger Ailes. May he rest in peace.
Somewhere.
Perhaps. Far from any nubile young women. I couldn't believe this man had been doing it for 30 years, and he walked away with a $20 or $10 million severance.
Yeah.
And he's the one we're hearing about. What?
And then he died.
And then he died.
Yeah.
And then he died.
Had a very expensive funeral.
Very expensive funeral. But that was an outrage. That was an outrage to me. And I assume other people
So you start
shared
with the
it.
outrage.
Well, sometimes.
Yeah.
Sometimes. I mean, sometimes you can't. I don't know about you too, but you know, unless you're writing a polemic, if you're trying to do humor, you know this. If you're too mad, it's not going to work.
True.
Unless you turn it into, you have to transmute it into something else. There has to be some humor in
You
it.
have
You
to get to
can't
the other
just,
side.
it can't be a screed, because
Right.
that's something else.
Right.
I think there's a great, humor can be there should be a more powerful word than humor, and I'm not even thinking of my own work. I'm thinking about Andy Borowitz and Gail Collins and other people whose work I really love, that they're not making light of things. They are keeping us all from kind of going crazy, I think.
Right.
And it's not just a tonic and a refreshment. It's some kind of like desperately needed thing. They are performing a social service. I think we could say the opposite of humor maybe is despair. And what they're saying is, you know, what's happening out there is we are engaged with it enough we care about it enough to do this. If we despair, then we're really in a terrible place.
Terrible place.
Rambling response.
No. Just picking up on the whole concept of just zeroing in on a topic. I'm going to throw it back to you, Rick. You're really writing. Fever Swamp is really all of them in one pitch. I mean, this is the subtitle, A Journey Through the Strange Neverland of the 2016 presidential race. And now, where are you going to go with this? Are you going to are you staying on this journey, or are you now going to branch out into something else?
Well, it's troubling to spend years and years and years with Donald Trump. I'm sure Melania feels much the same way.
Yeah.
But to Jenny's point, I actually think that in this unrelieved grimness, a certain amount of humor about Trump is important, because I think it not only it's funny sometimes, although the situation, but it also illuminates. I remember writing a long essay in the book where I started with the conceit that he was actually the idiot Ruritanian prince, and the king dies, and the counselor said, "Oh my God, he's king, what do we do?" And he's played by Peter Sellers, of course.
Yeah, right.
But I feel, look, am I going to change the world? Obviously not. Do I feel that I have some fundamental obligation, or at least feeling that I want to trace the trajectory of what's happening? Yes, because I think it's actually at bottom very serious. And one thing I wrote very early on, I think it's true, and I think we all have to be aware of it. Trump is not, first and foremost, strategic or tactical. He's not some intuitive genius. He is a guy with a profound personality disorder, and if you understand what it is, it's the organizing principle for everything he does. We have a president who's turning us into a reflection of his internal turmoil. Is totally self-referential, totally skewed internal turmoil. And I don't think that any of us, in whatever capacity we have, can be less than vigilant about that, whether we're engaged in politics or journalism or whether we're just voting. Because, this is an existential crisis. We've had bad presidents before, but not someone whose pathology is infecting us in such a way, and at a time where we're already badly polarized. I think it's also well to remember that Trump didn't create this. The conditions within the Republican Party and the larger society created Trump. And so, yeah, I'm going to keep at it.
Good, good. I just find it so hard to believe, and I'm hoping you're heading in that direction too, that we have become this polarized, and it's to the point where we elect a man who thinks with his knee. But I look out and say, why don't they see what we see? I mean, it's just sort of, it's one thing to have somebody who's not Hillary. It's another thing to have somebody who's completely in another world. But let's see where this takes us. Continuing on the line of topics, Maddie, you came up with this book which had nothing to do with your previous book. What are you working on now, or what made you decide to turn this concept into a book, this story?
Actually, I've always loved the island. When I first visited here in the 70s, I was like most people who, first time you come here, you fall in love. The first time was as a reporter. I went to a party that was a book party for Barbara Tuchman. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. And I remember Carly Simon showed up, and she was pregnant, and she was in a rage, or at least somewhat incensed, because there was a traffic jam at Five Corners in Vineyard Haven, and she couldn't quite, so I can't believe it. And I had my little notebook, and all I could say is, I'm interviewing the You're So Vain girl. So that was the beginning. I got invited here a few years later. I ended up in New Jersey. I worked as a journalist in Boston, but I ended up in New Jersey at a paper called the Trenton Times, which was briefly owned by the Washington Post. Were you there? No? You know it? Okay. At any rate, it was bought by the Washington Post right after Watergate, and I went there thinking, oh, I'll work in New Jersey for a little while, and then I'll end up in Washington. It wasn't as easy a path. Nonetheless, while I was there, I had to buy a car when I showed up, because in Boston I didn't need one.
Right.
The tea was great. But anyway, I showed up and needed a car, and the executive editor said, well, there's two people who can help you. There's an American car expert, and there was a fellow named Harry, who lived in the suburbs, who had a crew cut, had 4 kids, and covered the Trenton Speedway. Or there's this guy named John who has a car that keeps breaking down, but it's foreign, and John was young, lanky, tall. I said, okay, young, lanky, tall, I'll get a foreign car, and thus my first car was a VW. Anyway, he and I got to know each other, and he at one point said, my parents have a shack on Martha's Vineyard. Would you like to visit it? And I said, that sounds good. I was pleased that someone from New Jersey had heard of the vineyard, because, as I say, I have New England snobbery, and the New Jersey shore just didn't do it for me. So I met his family. John came from a family that had been for many years in Washington, D.C. His father was Nicholas de Belleville-Katzenbach, who was the former Attorney General of the United States, and the one who was known most famously for standing in the schoolhouse door and telling George Wallace that he had to integrate the University of Alabama. His mother is Lydia Katzenbach, who came from an old family, an old kind of somewhat conservative family, but she, like FDR, couldn't wait to be a traitor to her class, and was a very imposing person in her own way, more imposing in some ways than my future father-in-law. Anyway, I met these people. They were very elegant. We were at a nice restaurant in New York, and when John said there was a shack on the vineyard, I went, I'm a journalist. I know how to read people's living rooms. They don't have a shack. Yeah. I've seen his mother's hairdo, her nails, her high heels. Sure enough, we get to the island, we take the ferry. In those days, you could leave your car any place you wanted in Woods Hole. It didn't matter, willy-nilly, someone's driveway. We got on the boat, we get off of it, and we're hitchhiking. I think, oh, hitchhike, well, it's with the guy, And we go, past the airport, and down, finally we get to West Chisbury. And we find this dirt road that looked like a million other dirt roads, and we get out of the car and walk 2.2 miles down to the end of the dirt road to a peninsula where there is indeed an old fisherman's shack.
Oh, my God.
That in those days was quite primitive. It had been used by, generally, I guess, by rich people in Edgartown, men, to go to these shacks, and they would shoot geese and probably entertain girls and drink or whatever. So there was a hideaway. And the Cats and Backs had bought this and with the hope of eventually replacing it with a more substantial house, which they did in the late 70s. The more substantial house was still seasonal, no electricity. They really liked the idea of camping on the vineyard. Eventually it did get electricity, and eventually in the fullness of time, John's father died, the house was inherited by John and his 3 siblings, and they decided to sell it. As John said, the best thing to do in life is don't have siblings. Because then you might have the house. But the house got sold in 2014, which was a terrible summer. I have in my book, I list some of the things that happened that summer, but I realize every summer is terrible. Every winter, we're in the land of despondency to some degree, as we all agree. But I was overwhelmed by mixed feelings, and I kept thinking, okay, this was never my house. It's never going to be. I grew up in a family where I was raised by a widowed mother who had 5 children, 8 and under, and was pregnant with her 6th when my father died. We all went to public universities and Catholic schools. 3 of the sisters all have incredible pensions because we were the kind of people that believed we should have a pension. I'm going to be a real babe in the nursing home when I retire from UMass, because I can't wait. But we were just a normal family, and I didn't ever expect to have this beautiful 2 weeks every summer, and I never really had known about a place like the Vineyard. I didn't speak that language, so it was always, I was as if I was in a foreign country all these years, learning about the way some people live, and this particular spot was very reclusive, so we were not in any kind of social swirl. I was really on the outskirts, so the fancy partying didn't really apply to us. So if you read the book for the celebrity stuff, it's pretty slim. But there's some lovely family memories.
So what's next?
Oh, I'm working on a biography, which is very daunting to me because I've never written a biography. And after that, I want to write another memoir. Now, this will be my 3rd memoir. You could say, wait. But I want to write, I've written a memoir about my family called Uphill Walkers. But I want to, and this memoir is really partly about the Vineyard and a stealth memoir of my husband's family. The next memoir will be about covering Miami as a journalist, as a young journalist in the 1980s, when it was ground zero as kind of the worst place in the world to be.
May I
Are
ask Maddie a question?
Yeah, sure, go ahead. Please do.
When you talk about the new owner, I mean, oh, sorry, thank you, Paula.
Paula knows.
Isn't it also a book about sort of a changing landscape of the Vineyard and places like it, or a kind of idea of what it used to be like to rusticate and what that said about people and now now that it's changed, and maybe you could talk.
I was going to say
Right,
it's
sorry.
harder.
Yeah, sure.
It's
No.
harder and harder
Yeah.
to find places like what our place was. I don't know where they are. Maybe someone can secretly slip me a name on the way out of a place that would be worth visiting. But you have fantasies when you write books, and one of my fantasies is that every select person on the island and every person on the planning commissions, et cetera, read this. And think about what the island has represented to people over the years, and think that that is something worth preserving. So once again, I think I'm the anti-change person.
You just blithely went past the word biography. You want to explain what that might be?
Right
or-
now, I don't want to talk about it in too much
okay,
detail
okay.
because I haven't done enough research. I should be home researching.
Right, all right. Soon. Rusticate?
That's a nice
No,
word.
I feel a sudden urge for silver polish or something.
I mean, it's what, I mean, it's
I've only lived here for 6 years. I mean,
a notion that your life in the summer is different than your life in the
isn't
winter.
that worth a book?
Isn't that
That was it.
But which is a kind of concept that I think somebody was using. I guess I feel like I was the last person to hear this phrase, brown furniture. Have you ever heard of brown furniture? How nobody wants it anymore.
Yeah, that's it.
And I feel like that is the kind of idea that's gone the way of brown furniture. I mean, I feel like a piece of brown furniture, but that way of life is not so much desired anymore, and that you're talking about a certain kind of change, a profound change in how people live their lives, which indicates other things about them.
It's true that I think that on the island, people are more and more replicating what their winter houses are like. And this particular house was the opposite of the Katzenbach's winter house, and everything was beat up, no value, whatever. When we went to move, the movers gave us some stickers, red stickers to put on items of value. So remember looking around thinking, okay, there's a rusty lantern on the mantle, red sticker, I don't know. There were these were kind of awkward duck-shaped wicker bread baskets. Nobody wanted them.
Gotta have one. Yeah.
But finally, I looked out at the water, which the real estate agents call blue gold, and I thought, well, if only I could put a sticker on the view and figure out a way to fold it up, iron it nicely, put it in a box with styrofoam peanuts and protect it forever. Or how do you pack memories? How many memories can you put into a cardboard box before it bulges and bursts? And it was actually wanting to capture those abstractions. I think there's a line in here about my mother, who was Irish Catholic, who I said believed maybe far too deeply in the power of language to save the moment, the day, the week, the month, the year. She was one of those people utterly dedicated to words. She was not herself a writer. She was a grade school teacher. But her children became writers and thinkers about writing, and I think I probably write to, one of the impulses I have when I write is to somehow save the hour, the day, the week, the month, etc. And so the book is my way of saving something for myself that I couldn't have.
Yeah, great. I can't help but think brown furniture is what you can find on Tuesdays at the West Tisbury Dome, but it's all right. I hope they open it for you. Yeah,
And
right.
Some of that furniture in my house is from the West Tisbury, from the Dumptique.
Dumptique. Absolutely. I want to ask each one of the panelists let's flip the questioning around just for a second to say, can you talk, I'll start with you, Rick, can you talk about any writer that may have had influence on you?
I did want to add one thought about
Sure, go ahead.
Madeleine's book. I think all of us have had the feeling that it's an outrage that all these McMansions are being built by people who hardly use them. In my experience, real estate developers too often get what they want, which of course brings me back to Donald Trump.
All roads lead.
But now I've forgotten the question, of course.
It's okay.
I just had a significant birthday, and it seems to be having an effect.
I know those birthdays.
Yeah.
Who am I talking to? Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I forget.
Any particular writer or writing that you can look at as something that influenced you?
Well, I think in fiction there were a lot of people, but talking about this kind of thing I'm writing now. Lord, there are all sorts of good examples. I think David Brooks is somebody who has a depth way beyond, the business of politics and even policy day to day. He's writing some very interesting stuff about American society, which I think are important. I'd like to do more of it. Back when I was a kid, and I think that's where you really choose your exemplars, two polar opposites, William Buckley and Gore Vidal, who hated each other. But they both wrote very intelligent, stylish stuff which did not insult the intelligence of the audience. They assumed that they were writing for bright people and they could engage them by writing well. and writing amusingly, but also writing in a challenging fashion.
Yeah.
So I think those kinds of people who've written with penetration and elegance and, in David's case, for example, a depth beyond the norm. That's what anybody doing my particular work now should aspire to.
That's good. Thanks. Maddie?
I could talk about writers forever, so I think I'll keep this sort of short. But in the book, I mentioned that at one point, because of my time at the Trenton Times, et cetera, Washington Post, I got to meet Katharine Graham, and we had a once-a-year lunch or dinner together. And during that period of time, she was working on her wonderful memoir, Personal History, which I highly recommend. And as you can imagine, it's a little hard to think of what's a good hostess gift for Mrs. Graham. Because really, at her lunches or dinners, the best gift you could bring is to personally bring presidential buzz. You know, at one point, different people would show up who were very politically wired and going to run for office. So I gave her 2 books that influenced me in writing memoir and in teaching memoir to young students at the university. This Boy's Life by Tobias Wolff, which is a really meticulously observed book about a very endangered childhood. And then, even though he's very out of favor, and boy, he is the ultimate man who he was probably the first man who saw women as brown furniture, Ernest Hemingway.
Oh, yeah.
Ernest Hemingway's The Movable Feast, which, though set almost 100 years ago in Paris, feels true today, and has wonderful writing advice. So those are 2 books I would just throw out to you. If you're thinking about writing a memoir, anybody in this room, those 2 books are 2 of my real go-tos.
Well, I do love that Andy Borowitz comes in over in my email every day.
Yeah.
And I do read him. I love Ian Fraser. I love his work. I do tend to read comic novels. I don't know if any of you have read a book by Gary Steingart called Little Failure.
Little Failure. I have.
Oh my God!
Yeah.
I mean, to me,
It's a wonderful book.
What a fantastic book! Kathleen Shine has written a wonderful book called "They May Not Mean to, But They Do" about caring for older parents. And that doesn't sound that funny, but it is. It's funny and soulful and all those things. That it is based on. I mean, the title comes from a Philip Larkin poem, the only 2 lines of which I can remember. One has, the
first line, you want
They fuck you up.
They fuck you up.
fuck you up, your mom and dad.
Your mom and dad.
They may not mean to, but they do.
Yeah.
And it's the most affectionate portrait of her mother, of a mother, in it. So.
And the title is something like "This is the verse" or "This be the verse."
Yes,
Yeah,
yes, that's right.
Got a title that has nothing to do with
Right.
it. Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, just to wrap that part up, because I'm now just thinking, listening to you all, that given the political climate we're in, I keep hearkening back to Kurt Vonnegut. I'm haunted by every novel he's ever written, and it just always reminds me of where we're going and what we're living through. And as much as he's a fiction writer, a lot of the things that he was saying sort of ring true to me. And one particular quote that I think of on a daily basis from him is, "True terror is when you wake up one morning and discover that your high school class is running the country."
Wouldn't he have been? Don't you miss him so much?
Absolutely.
Oh,
Absolutely.
I mean,
he also said, "If you believe in telekinesis, please raise my hand." Another one I really like.
He also said,
I'm channeling Vonnegut. I'm sorry.
Arnie, he also said, he once told a story about being with his elderly uncle on a summer day, and his uncle at one point putting down a glass of lemonade and saying, "Let's just stop with all this agreeable blather and just say, isn't this really nice to be here?" And then Vonnegut used to tell that story and say to everyone, "Please notice when you're happy."
yeah.
Oh, yes. Yes. Is this a good time for me to toss this out to the audience? We've got about 10, 15 minutes. I would like to ask anyone if they have any particular questions of any panelists at this stage. Yes, Reisman.
Let's just wait for one of these.
Okay, sorry.
Microphones?
A man with a microphone
There
is
we
coming.
go.
Start over there.
Question
Okay.
for Professor Blais. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly.
That's correct.
Blais.
Yeah.
When you're teaching journalism to your students, what do you say about the responsibility of different platforms in terms of, particularly for social change?
Well, you mean the platforms that are dedicated to, say, one single-minded idea, or what?
Well, how do you help them discern, in an age when our president is tweeting all the time,
Yeah.
and on the heels of social media being used, to certain good in recent elections, how do you help them figure out what social media is appropriate to use for social change, and when should they steer clear of that?
Well, that's a big subject. I would say that we do teach courses in media literacy, and we try to bring the students' awareness level up as to which platforms are doing what, and to just figure out which ones have real journalists working for them, as opposed to people who are polemicists or people who are trying to, create change in a chaotic way. But we do our best to just have that be part of the atmosphere. Every class sort of has that as an underpinning, the understanding that you have to know what's out there and pay attention to it.
Microphone there. Rosemary.
Hi, thank you. I'm going back to this issue about the segmentation of our nation right now, and the fact that people are getting their facts and getting their information from so many really segregated sources. I'm reflecting back on the power of comedy to humanize different perspectives, and the power of a show like All in the Family to really expose bigotry, racism, and to put it in a human form and hold it up in a way that someone like Edith could then moderate it and really try to probe, how do we resolve perspectives and beliefs that are just unfounded in today's society. And is there an opportunity today to think about some type of an approach that begins to humanize these different perspectives and to really have them in a comedic form that can appeal to a broad audience?
Wait,
You can speak to that.
how,
still
are you
thinking.
asking how?
Yes.
The first thing that you just reminded me of is that Norman Lear, who created All in the Family, is being given a Kennedy honor. And the first thing he said is that he's boycotting the White House dinner that precedes it. So, I'll go back to what Jenny said too. I just think it's something that you have to use to remain sane. But at the same time, satire is very, very, ripe right now, and it's definitely needed. Every time we've had any kind of bad situation, and it's not just Americans, but cultures have resorted to, the barb and trying to use the pen to correct a situation by at least holding it up to ridicule. I don't know what more we can do, except for when you start talking about Andy Borowitz. For those of you who don't know, has a column that he writes for the New Yorker, and it's basically he just takes the news of the day, as crazy as it is, and makes it crazier. Nothing is coming to mind right now, but it's the kind of thing where it's right on the money. It just basically tells you in one headline with about 2 paragraphs of a fake story how crazy we now are, just to keep you on track with the idea that none of this should be considered to be normal. Go ahead. I think you need to talk about this.
No, I'm just trying to think of, a lot of our, there's a lot of good stuff going on television. I mean, now that we have, Netflix and original programming and all these, there's too much good television.
I watch John Oliver a lot too, because I think that
Yes,
it's a half an hour of yelling in a funny way.
No, they don't
No.
watch that. Do you mean sort of, you're saying, is there something that could speak to all of us that we, I wonder what that,
I mean, the problem, partially, I think, is segmentation, too. All in the Family was on when there were 3 major networks. And maybe
yes.
something else limping along.
Yes.
Now we have, 85 channels and nothing to watch. And it's the problem really is so much larger than it used to be because we have geographic segmentation. Hillary Clinton carried 16% of American counties and won the popular vote, which gives you some idea. We have demographic sorting. We have informational sorting. So it's not only that people don't watch the same programs or read the same paper, they don't live in the same places, they don't know the other people. And one of the real problems that Trump has exacerbated is he's told people that people disagree with you are not simply wrong. They're the enemy of all that you hold dear, and they hold you particularly in contempt. And one of the things that really has animated Trump's base is that, the feeling that they're flyover people, the lucky folks like us, are mocking. And I think it's very hard to think of a mass media that cuts through all of that, given the kind of segmentation. You know, what I've said on a serious point is a little apart from your question, but what the Democrats have to do is address broad economic issues that reach a whole lot of people, whether they are whatever ethnicity or sexual preference, or regardless of where they live, and then say America is a stronger place when we liberate the capacities of all and make people hope that they have a real opportunity. And it's the kind of anxiety that people have so much has been preyed on that makes it so difficult. Humor, though, I think, God, if it could be delivered, I think the gentlest way to persuade people that Trump is not all he could be is some gentle laughter. That would be a good start.
I think it's very telling, too, in some regard, that it's very difficult for writers or journalists to reach the Trump base. When the startling statistic to me was that just about, well, it was way over 50% of those who voted and continue to support Donald Trump never went 50 miles beyond their birthplace. And you have to think about that. And all that keeps coming to mind is a great quote from Mark Twain that said, "Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness."
So we have time for one more question.
Yeah.
We have it right here.
How significant is your relationship with your editor?
Ah, good question. How significant is your relationship with your editor?
Well, it's starting with fiction first. I had some superb editors, and I had one particularly that was marvelous. And what he did was he gave my book 2 readings. The first was an overview for, with the general sense of, do we need all of this? Do we need more or less? Not word for word, but conceptually how the narrative was working. And then he would go back over word to word, because word for word, because he said, really those are 2 different lenses. And I thought he was right. He did a superb job. Look, I was a professional writer. I think I was pretty good, but I'd say he made my novels 10% better. And 10% better is a serious thing. In journalism, I try to not make my editor find the ice sculpture in a block of ice. I try to turn in 750 words, 1,500 words that are absolutely as clean as I can make them, because writing or rewriting. And as a result, I've fulfilled part of my mission, which is to make her life easier.
Maddie?
Well, I'd say I owe my entire career to a series of great editors. The most current editor is George Gibson, who's at Grove Atlantic. I don't know if he's in the room right now, but he'll be here tomorrow for sure. He's an old school scholar of individual words, but also the big picture, and just a very, I'd say, comforting presence in my life. So I'm very grateful to have him.
Yeah, my editor is the person who reached out and said we could do a book of this. So I'm insanely grateful. She's my age. She gets my voice. And that's, it's not a small thing. That is, most of my magazine editors have been gently fired for being too old. If I write to Huffington Post and I don't even hear back. I mean, there's a certain point where you think, I'm just grateful, hugely grateful that she published me. Right. And I mean, there's that. Yeah. Just many of us have things to say, but we can't find somebody to read them and say, my goodness, let's put that out there. So, of course, I owe her everything.
Good. Good.
Yeah.
That's it?
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all. Thank you.
So we'd like to thank the panel for their insight and humor, and it will be continued in the Menemsha room just outside the hallway to the right.